Today we are joined by Alex Cohen, who is a environmental activist and someone who works closely with Jessica Reznicek, a water protector who is currently in federal prison, which we'll get into more later on in this interview. But before we start, Alex, do you have any kind of special introduction that you'd like to give?
Yeah, just thanks for having me and the campaign to free Jessica Reznicek and giving voice to, you know, her struggle and what she's going through, even though she's behind bars.
So before we get started, can you just tell us who Jessica Reznicek is? What kind of person was she? And, what are the kind of instances or the history that led her to do what she did?
Yeah, so Jessica has been a part of the Des Moines Catholic worker community for over 10 years now. She kind of came to that through Occupy Wall Street and kind of realizing, the systemic imbalance in society. And so she went to Occupy Wall Street and was kind of radicalized through that process and found the Des Moines Catholic worker community. In that community, it led her really to a lot of anti-war and peace and nonviolent organizing. Jessica spent time, in Palestine, standing amongst Palestinians in the occupied territories, was eventually deported from Israel or from Palestine twice by Israeli authorities. And she was in Korea and she was protesting the expansion of U.S. naval bases there. And so she kind of has this long history of dedication to nonviolent resistance and really standing with people from a global perspective. And um, kind of fast forwarding to the No Dakota Access Pipeline fight. She was in Iowa. She had just got done with a campaign that was protesting Northrop Grumman, which is a weapons manufacturer. And she had just got out of prison. Actually, she was serving a 3-month prison sentence for an action she did against Northrop Grumman in state prison. And Jessica, in true character, was representing herself and preparing her entire defense from her jail cell because she was, wanted to make the trial as political as possible and had refused bail, which is why she was in the jail, kind of preparing for her sentence. And I think, these little stories are important because they tell a lot about Jessica's kind of commitment to justice and passion. And so she heard that there was indigenous youth running from North Dakota to Washington, D.C. to stop this pipeline and that they would be passing through Iowa because the pipeline goes through her home state of Iowa. And so she decided to join the indigenous youth on the run to Washington, D.C., asking Obama to stop the pipeline. After that, she went back to the Standing Rock Reservation, and she realized and kind of reflected, and She talks about this a lot. How she kind of sat with that the pipeline goes through a majority of her state, where she grew up. The water she grew up swimming in as a kid, and that she felt like she should go home and really fight the same pipeline in Iowa. And so she kind of, answered that calling. She went to Iowa. She found where they were drilling underneath the Mississippi River. And she was by herself in the middle of the night and she started finding tires and things to blockade the only access road to the site. And, she showed up the next day, or the police showed up the next day in this small town and asked her, "What are you doing?" They had never really seen a protest before. And she's like, "Oh, I'm blocking access here." And they were very confused. And they eventually arrested her, let her go. She did it again the next day. They arrested her and then let her go 24 hours later. And she asked the sheriff where she could be without being arrested. And he pointed to the ditch. And so she started an occupation of this ditch and asked the world to join her, and slowly people did. And that's actually when I met her 2 weeks later after she started this kind of this occupation.
Yeah, thanks for that history. And just real quickly, for our listeners, maybe you can talk a little bit about who the Catholic workers are, because when I was living in Vermilion, South Dakota, of all places, there were Catholic workers. There was a Catholic workers collective in Yankton, the neighboring town, and that's actually where I learned, where I first learned about abolition. Actually, and they worked closely with us to get the youth death penalty abolished in South Dakota, as well as taught me a lot about international politics. They were protesting the School of Americas, which trains kind of guerrilla and clandestine fighters in Latin America to like orchestrate coups and to all do the dirty business of U.S. empire. But maybe you can talk a little bit about who the Catholic workers are, and why somebody like Jessica joined them, and what was it about that group specifically that appealed to her kind of person?
Totally. So Catholic workers community came from Dorothy Day, and it's basically the idea that you have to have take the words literally of kind of service, and but also like a deeply held principle that one cannot just give someone food. They have to see why the person is hungry in the first place. And so many Catholic worker communities believe in devoting, taking a vow of poverty and then devoting most of their time, split 50-50, to resistance work, so systemic change through direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience, and also through direct service work or hospitality work. So, soup kitchens or opening parts of your community up to shelter for those that need it. Um, and the Des Moines Catholic worker community that Jessica was a part of is an amazing community, has many different houses. So Jessica spends a majority of her time there making food for the unhoused community. They offer many different kinds of hospitality for the unhoused residents of the neighborhood. And then they also have a house dedicated to resistance, which is named the Berrigan House. And there was two little cats, Phil and Dan, named after the Berrigan brothers, who were two priests who, during the Vietnam War, kind of really popularized this Catholic worker type of action called plowshare actions. And this is where they go in, they physically, destroy or symbolically destroy weapons of war. And then they usually do some symbolic thing of pouring their blood on this weapon of war, and then they stand and own up to it in the press and in the courts, and they try and raise awareness about what's going on. And it's called a plowshares action because they're trying to actualize a quote in the Bible, which says, I don't know it exactly, but no nation will raise their sword against another nation anymore, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares. And Jessica was very much in her Dakota Access Pipeline action, acting from the influence and perspective of a plowshares action. In terms of the contemplation, in terms of owning up to it, and in terms of trying to help the Catholic workers see that climate change and the fossil fuel industry is the new way to resist these wars, and the plowshares movement can expand beyond just targeting the traditional things that say the Berrigan brothers or other Catholic workers kind of went after.
Awesome. Thank you for that background, Alex. I actually just learned about the Catholic workers just this past year, and I found out that they actually have two houses here in Albuquerque, too. It's very interesting stuff. My next question for you was about terrorism enhancement sentencing. So, what is it, and why is Reznicek's case so important for us to understand terrorism enhancement?
So similar to similar to what I was talking about, how Jessica did a press conference and she owned up to what she did. She was expecting to spend some time in prison. She was initially charged with 9 felonies and was facing like over 120 years in federal prison. And she ended up taking a plea agreement to conspiracy, which is the only one that had a 0 to 20, so no mandatory minimum sentencing guideline. So in theory, the judge could have said, you served this much time on house arrest, there's time served, understood the implications of the climate crisis, given time served. So that was kind of like what we were going into, but not long before sentencing, we heard that the federal government was going to pursue this terrorism enhancement at Jessica's sentencing. Honestly, Jessica's legal team, as well as many of us, including Jessica, didn't think it had any chance of sticking, because the grounds that the federal government was using to justify their use of the terrorism enhancement was actually not her actions as much as it was her words. So, in order for something to be considered terrorism, according to the federal government, you have to directly, attack the government or government employees, in like retribution, or to influence government conduct with, violence or so forth. Jessica targeted a private corporation. The Dakota Access Pipeline, at least on paper, is a private corporation. It is not a government entity. The pipeline is not a public pipeline, it's a private pipeline. So nothing about the pipeline was government property. But what the feds used, and they even said was their gold star evidence, was that at some points in Jessica's life, while protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline, she critiqued the regulatory process of the government. And so we're seeing a situation where the federal government is justifying, and a judge is agreeing, um, that the use of the terrorism enhancement is not because of Jessica's actions, but because she critiqued the regulatory, the process of the government. So it's deeply a free speech issue, and I think people, like don't realize that. She was never charged with any crime of terrorism. She was never indicted on any crime of terrorism. It was only an enhancement that was added at her sentencing. So her actions are not what are at play, it's her speech. And so I think that should terrify all of us, because this is a new precedent that's being set, um, that really has implications on everyone, whether you engage in, civil disobedience or not.
Wow. So where did these terrorism enhancements come from? Like, is this related to like legislation that was policies created like in response to the war on terror? Like, yeah, what is the inception of these charges or the enhancement?
Yeah. So this specific enhancement came after the Oklahoma City bombing of the FBI building, and but after that, it has been morphed a few times. So that's kind of where it originated. But after 9/11, it was changed even more. Specific language was changed, and then we saw these enhancements used during the Green Scare in the early 2000s against animal rights activists, specifically. And since then, there was very little outcry about that when it was used, against environmental activists. But since then, we never saw it used until Jessica. So it had been, 2 decades since we've seen these enhancements used against, protesters, in the country.
Wow. So, and we're seeing that terrorism charges are being applied kind of more liberally now. Just after forest protector Tortuga was murdered in Atlanta recently, 20 arrest warrants for forest protectors were issued, slapping them with terrorism charges, though none of them had seriously injured anyone or committed any violent crimes. And so, what are the consequences of redefining terrorism this way?
Yeah, so when when Jessica was originally preparing for her trial, we didn't really have a big campaign or support team in place. Jessica is a very like um independent person in a way where, she had like her spiritual community guiding her, which was a community of nuns that she was living with before she went to prison. And it wasn't until at the sentencing, when we were there, that the judge applied the terrorism enhancement, and luckily let Jessica self surrender at a later date, which was also ironic, because if the judge thought Jessica was a terrorist, why then would she let her leave the courtroom and self surrender after her sentencing at a later date, which was like 2 months later? But luckily that was the case. And so we were able to be with Jessica after this terrorism enhancement was implied. And that's when we sat down. We were like, whoa, this is way bigger than Jessica. And Jessica's like, yes, this is way bigger than my case because this terrorism enhancement was applied. And that kind of bore in the appeal process, this clemency process, and this public thing. Because right after we said Jessica, what happens to Jessica happens to all of us, she's the first and she won't be the last. And I think what's important to see is that in Atlanta, the governor had been calling them domestic terrorists for a long time, and the initial charges that were domestic terror charges in Atlanta came in December, and then Tortuguita was murdered a month later, and I think what's like really clear is that when you call someone a terrorist, when a state calls anyone a terrorist, it's a political move. And it's a political move to dehumanize them to the point in the public eye that you can then violate their civil rights in broad daylight. In the case of Tortuguita, you can murder them in broad daylight in a public park. And you can throw them into jail cells for indefinite times based on things that, may or may not be, constitution, may not be terrorism or not. And so we're seeing a clear agenda from the fossil fuel industry being implemented here by governments at the federal level and at the state level to call people terrorists to continue pushing through fossil fuel projects, as the climate crisis escalates. And I think what's important in Jessica's case is this was not random. 84 Congress members asked the Department of Justice by name to call Jessica a domestic terrorist, as well as asked the Department of Justice to call the valve turners domestic terrorists. And at the same time, the Department of Homeland Security compared the valve turners to, mass killers and white supremacists on terms of a threat level. So this has all been a long time in the making. And again, it's painful to say, but just as we were saying, Jessica wasn't going to be the last with terrorism, I think we're going to see that Tortuguita isn't going to be the last, because at the state level in Georgia, there has been the terrorism rhetoric from the state has only ramped up after. It has not calmed down in any way.
Let's take a step back here, Alex, and think about ecoterrorism and the Green Scare, but also the way that the state itself, the small s state, like the state of Georgia, and then the big S, capital S state, the federal government, uses bipartisanship to basically criminalize people who are defending land. In the case of in the case of Georgia, those domestic terrorism charges arise from a state bill that came in response to the brutal killings that were perpetrated by Dylan Roof, to basically create a category to prosecute or to identify ostensibly white nationalists or white supremacists, terrorists who are committing acts of violence specifically against Black people. But now we're seeing it used against people who are anti-racist, who are abolitionists in that sense. But even somebody like Barack Obama was pushing for these ecoterrorism, charges and enhancements when he was a senator. And we also saw, it was Barack Obama's FBI that infiltrated the water protector movement, which led to federal charges being, applied to, Red Fawn. And so walk us through that history, because I think it's a pivotal moment. The FBI wasn't really taking seriously like white nationalist terrorists, because you had like Timothy McVeigh and the blowing up of the Oklahoma City federal building, but then you had the same kind of intense scrutiny and surveillance and policing of organizations like Earth First, who are not targeting human beings, but in fact many of their actions that were considered ecoterrorism were targeting a construction equipment. So can you walk us through that history and the kind of the bipartisanship, because it's on both sides. It's not just Republicans. It's not just a right wing thing. It's also a liberal thing, and how that kind of rhetoric and the ramping up of a new green scare is kind of playing into this current moment.
Yeah, so a part of, I think, the security state has always been, and people on the left have always warned that whenever these, terrorism laws are passed, we know that who they're going to negatively impact. And once they're on the books, it's very hard to remove them, and you give discretion to prosecutors to then interpret and use as will on people in the population who, you know, hopefully can mount a defense if it's unjustified to try and fight them. And so I think you've been seeing this layering and this expansion. So at first, terrorism laws were passed, and then slowly they were amended to, and their changing of language and their amendments of the terrorism laws specifically came after things that weren't relative to their initial purpose. So, for instance, if you take the Georgia terrorism law, which was originally passed in 2015, I believe, and it was amended through this wave of anti-protest legislation that came after the Standing Rock movement. So we're talking critical infrastructure bills. We're talking other anti-terror state laws across the state, which was all legislation written by ALEC, the right-wing policy institute, who writes legislation for Congress members to then, who mostly just copy and paste and introduce as is. We saw the Georgia law amended again during this wave of critical infrastructure laws to basically move the language away from violence against people in only government entities to be expanded to include private corporations as well as property. Um, and so you kind of see, like, once these precedents are set, um, it's people are relatively quiet about them, and then in the background they're expanding and kind of fortifying to come after people that they disagree with politically. And that's what we're seeing in the case of Atlanta. That's what we're seeing in the case of these critical infrastructure laws. And that's what we're seeing with the use of the federal terrorism enhancement. The interesting thing about the federal terrorism enhancement is Um, it hasn't been amended in quite some time, and we're seeing the application of it being used with a different kind of angle that the feds are kind of just creating on the fly, talking about using language to kind of really hone in on their case.
So, just for clarity, Alex, so like you're saying there is a direct line that can be drawn from the ALEC legislation, the anti protest laws that were adopted immediately after Standing Rock, and the use of terrorism enhancement now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, after the No DAPL movement, we saw dozens of states introduce critical infrastructure laws, which basically made it go from a misdemeanor to a felony, in some cases to just simply trespass on a construction site that these laws deemed critical infrastructure, which includes pipelines, landfills, mining sites, I mean, you name it. It basically increased simple trespass to a felony, and we saw that completely sponsored by the ALEC industry. At the same time, 80 Republicans and 4 Democrats wrote a bipartisan letter to the Department of Justice. It was Jeff Sessions at the time asking Jessica and the Valve Turners to be sentenced as domestic terrorists. And at the same time, we saw states passing laws that would make it these anti-terror, so-called anti-terror laws. And this was all a uniform effort pushed by ALEC and the fossil fuel industry. And we're seeing the consequences of it now. In Louisiana, you have, people from the Louis Levy fight who are challenging these critical infrastructure laws. And it's the only lawsuit I know going forward to challenge the constitutionality of the laws in general. And that case is kind of moving forward now. So we're slowly starting to see people fight back as people are being charged with this.
Wow. So Jessica Reznicek and Ruby Montoya were the first water protectors to be charged with the federal terrorism enhancement. And are there other cases that they're looking at from Standing Rock right now?
Um, we have no clue. In terms of the federal government, um, yeah, we have no clue. Both of the sentencings are over, and both Ruby and Jessica are serving their sentences. If the feds are still investigating things from Standing Rock, aren't really sure. Um, but I wouldn't be, surprised that the federal government is heavily involved in what's happening in Georgia. We also saw like in line three, we saw the police, the state basically let the oil company buy the public police force to police its pipeline. And we saw, fusion centers being used to monitor protest up in Minnesota, which are supposed to be reserved for, in the case, the ones that were activated for, domestic terror activities. So you're seeing basically the use of terrorism against the climate justice movement, against indigenous people, just be completely normalized. And on what level it's manifesting, whether it's the fusion centers in Minnesota, the federal terrorism enhancement here, or the murder of Tortuguita in Atlanta. Um, just this like broad sweeping across the United States of yeah, the normalization of making climate action, analogous with terrorism.
Just to follow up to that question, because I think in the kind of popular mainstream discourse, when you're talking about environmental justice, abolition doesn't often get paired with that. But I think what we're seeing right now with the Stop Cop City protests, and even Jessica Reznicek's case, and the federal terrorism enhancement charges that she was sentenced with, and she's facing years in federal prison. That abolition and environmental justice or climate justice, what have you, are deeply integrated. And in fact, many of the water protectors, indigenous and non-indigenous water protectors who participate in these frontline actions and often put themselves on the line, are doing so not just in opposition to a pipeline, but also in opposition to the prisons that oftentimes accompany those pipelines, or the police, the buildup of police forces that accompany these things. And I think the Cop City protest right now, the Stop Cop City movement, I should say, is looking at the way that, in a very kind of in your face way, that the policing of people, everyday people, is actually environmentally bad, right? But I think in general, like there's always kind of been that strain of abolition to, or police abolition and prison abolition to, the environmental justice movement. Can you talk a little bit more about that, like in how it relates to Jessica Reznicek's case, but also our current moment?
Yeah, and I think that's a big reason the authorities are terrified of what's happening in Atlanta, because they are merging these two issues. And we see that kind of historically, that when, movements come out of their silos and they start to build intersectionality, the state responds in a different way to try and quell it. Um, and so I think that's part of what we're seeing in Atlanta. And yeah, people who take nonviolent civil disobedience and direct action, I think, are moved to, just by the mere fact, especially people who come from privileged backgrounds who don't just have police interactions that can end violently, just by being who they are moved to this perspective just by the police being who they are. And so groups like maybe a largely like white folks in the environmental movement, when they start to, do civil disobedience or direct action, they start having interaction with the police where the police are a hostile entity, and they start to go to jail for the first time. I think you hear a lot of people who talk about who had never been to jail before but were arrested at an action, and were like, that moved them to abolition. They were like, this place is horrible. There is nothing humane about it. There is nothing, you know, rehabilitation about it. Like, this has to go. This system doesn't work. And so I think part of why you see that is that in the environmental movement, there tends to be a lot of direct action and civil disobedience. And so there tends to be a lot of interaction and confrontation and just experience with the carceral system. And so by nature of experiencing the police state, I think people are generally moved towards abolition and seeing kind of the absurdity of it. Um, and sometimes I think it's hard strategically to make those connections, but there is like no better example than what is happening in Atlanta and the clear cutting of a forest that the city government in like 2017 passed a resolution to protect because of climate change as a buffer, and then in 2021 decided to reverse that and tear it down so that way the cops could, learn how to brutalize people who were practicing their First Amendment in cities across the country.
Right. Truly couldn't be more blatant, right? So, what is the status of Jessica's case today? Is there like is there an appeals or legal or political movement to get her out right now? Like, what can our audience do to support that?
Yeah, so Jessica has served about 500 days in prison. Immediately after her immediately after her sentencing, she filed an appeal to overturn the enhancement. So again, the case is focused specifically on the use of the terrorism enhancement. She's not necessarily, trying to reverse her guilty plea or do anything about that. She owned up to what she did. And just as we're saying, she's not a terrorist. So the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a very conservative circuit court, the most conservative in the United States, heard her appeal. It was 3 Trump-appointed judges who heard her appeal, and it wasn't the worst ruling, but it wasn't the best ruling. They basically said maybe the terrorist enhancement was misapplied, and it shouldn't have been used against Jessica. But whether or not it was misapplied, it was a quote harmless error. And they're just going to leave it alone and not affirm or reverse the terrorism enhancement, but affirm her 8-year sentence. So that left us in a position where we could ask the entire Eighth Circuit Court to hear the case again, or we could go to the U.S. Supreme Court. Just general concerns from that is that we get a worse ruling that flat out says Jessica is a domestic terrorist. They confirm the use of the enhancement, and that precedent is further set. So right now the terrorism enhancement stands on shaky grounds. It's just one federal judge who has kind of said definitively that it should have been used against Jessica, and we see that as like an okay spot to be in from a movement perspective, right? This hasn't been affirmed by a higher court, and there's like potential to kind of change that. So our best chance going forward is to appeal to Joe Biden for clemency. So we're in the initial stages of kind of meeting with the clemency team. Jessica's meeting with the clemency team of lawyers, and we plan to kind of really launch that campaign really soon. And we're going to need a lot of support when it comes to that campaign. And we just want to stress, and one thing that's so important to us and Jessica is making these connections. Just that none of this is happening in a silo. So aside from trying to get Jessica out as soon as possible, we want to reverse this precedent. We want to, stop the state from designating the climate justice movement as domestic terrorist. We want to kind of reframe and help reclaim the narrative away from this fear-mongering narrative and this painting of people as, as this, violent or a terrorist entity. And so that's like a huge part of our campaign and a huge thing we want to do with the clemency campaign. So we want to lift up the voices of people in Georgia, people who fought Line 3, people suing to overturn the critical infrastructure laws in Louisiana, and also across the globe. And so we want to lift up, people who have historically been called terrorists, for, trying to fight for liberation. So people in Palestine, we want to lift up people in the Philippines who also are fighting an anti-terror law to criminalize environmental dissent. In Europe, in the UK, you're seeing people get extremely lengthy sentences, which is very uncommon for Europe in the UK, just in general, long prison sentences. And so you're starting to see that happen against people for blocking traffic and climate protests. And of course, people in Latin America who have been getting murdered for land defense and water protection. And so we really see this as a global trend being pushed by the fossil fuel industry. We see none of it happening, disconnected from one another. And our best way out is really to join together and make these connections. Because when people in the general public, let's say, just focus in on one person, they can kind of, they don't see the bigger picture that this could impact them, that, Jessica's the first, but they actually could be next. And maybe not because they have ever thought that they could do what Jessica did, but simply because they see that, they might do something that they thought was protected or should be protected and ends up not being because of the new precedent that is coming out at a global level. And when it happens at a global level, there's less and less room for accountability. Yeah.
Yeah, and just some parting thoughts here. I see Jessica Reznicek as a political prisoner. A political prisoner is being, it's while it's punishing an individual, it's also punishing a movement. It's trying to say, this is what can happen to you if you decide to do this, right? And I think there are many lessons to be learned, especially in this moment in time. I think there's a fallacy to say that somehow the Republicans who are ostensibly anti-state are somehow good allies in this moment to push against reforms against the police state, or to even say that there's a sympathetic shoulder that you can cry on with the Democrats who have actually helped expand the police state. And in both, you're talking about both sides, here in terms of her case, and that it's come to the point that executive clemency is the only kind of solution, which means that everyday people who find themselves in these situations may not have the kind of legal resources to go through that. And that's what these kind of charges are meant to do. They're meant to exhaust movements. They're meant to slow them down. And I think the strategies that you're proposing of turning this into a campaign are actually strategies that the Leonard Peltier clemency campaign have put forward, that this isn't just about one individual, that this is about a movement, right? And we saw at the height of the water protector movement, the height of the indigenous struggle in the United States in 2016, that even the president himself, who had visited that reservation community, who had visited the Standing Rock Nation, who had Native children put on his lap, could not be moved to actually save the water of those children, right? So begging for sympathy just simply doesn't work in this moment in time. And what I'm hearing from this is that we need real substantive change, right? And that doesn't come by just asking for forgiveness from these politicians or asking them to see us as human beings. But I think I want to give the kind of last word to Jessica. And what would she say to the movement right now, and what her actions, and the kind of the imprisonment that she's enduring right now? What would she say to water protectors, to the Stop Cop City people who are on the front lines, those who are marching in the streets for the murder of Tyree Nichols?
Yeah, before she went to prison, she wore a shirt that said, "You can jail the resistor, but not the resistance." And she wore that in all of the last media interviews she did, kind of in her finals days before she self-surrendered. And since she's been in, she's been really trying to be a part of the prison community and support the people in there. She hasn't asked us for more money for herself, but she's always asked for, this person needs this and this person needs this book. And since she's been in, she's been really involved in her community. And I think she wore that shirt on the last day as her last message kind of to us, which was that don't let them stop you. They can put me in jail, but keep going. They can jail the resistor, but they can't jail the resistance. And I think that was kind of the last thing she wanted us to be with.
So where can people find her campaign and support her campaign?
So the website is support Jessica Reznicek, and you can remember how to spell her last name by thinking Res Nice K and .com. And she is on the website there. You can kind of find like a legal timeline of everything we've been going through. And you can also sign the petition. The petition is important because the petition will get you on the email list, and that is where will be the best way to stay in touch in terms of, you know, what we're going to need when it comes time to launch this clemency campaign and kind of stay up to date on the most recent news that's going on with the case. And one thing to kind of look out for, which you'll also get an email about on the email list if you sign the petition, is we either in February or March, we're going to do an international webinar, again, highlighting this global criminalization of the climate justice movement. And we already have some folks confirmed from Palestine and the Philippines, and we've reached out to folks from India and the UK. And so we really hope that this is kind of a time to both come together as people facing this state repression globally, and also bring people in who don't necessarily know that this is happening on such a scale, and hopefully start to do things about it and change the tide.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. It's been wonderful having you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you all for having us.